Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you guys my organization system that I use to organize and plan my PhD as well as other commitments. I want to structure this video by first giving you guys an overview of the system and the different apps that I use, and then I'll go through how I plan for the week ahead so that you guys can see this system in action. And also just a bit of a disclaimer, what I'm doing is not perfect. It's been working well so far for me, but it is a bit of an iterative process. And I imagine that over the course of my PhD, this system will definitely change and I'll adapt different things depending on my needs. So I do hope that you go away with some ideas from this video, but obviously don't feel like you have to follow this system exactly as it is, because everybody has different needs and the ways they work and like to visualize information, and this is the system that kind of works for me and how I like to see my tasks and things that I have to do kind of laid out in a particular way. So first of all, I tend to think of this system as serving different needs, and the main distinction that I tend to draw is between information management as well as task management. So where do I store information that I'll need to come back to at some later point, and where do I put my list of things to do? And for me, this is quite an important distinction because I tend to think of information kind of keeping up bookmarks and resources as very separate to organizing things that I need to do, like organizing myself personally. So first, I'll just talk a bit about the information management side of things. And for this, I use Notion and Obsidian. So I wanted to initially use Notion for everything, but I kind of ended up abandoning it except for a few things, and I'll go into why a bit later on. So essentially the only things that I found Notion to be useful for is to store all of my meeting notes, and I really like having this table view so I can see easily who I had the meeting with and when, and whether it was in person or on Zoom, and what the general topic of the meeting is. And then I can go into each meeting and see what we actually talked about. And it's also quite handy to have this kind of template to help me organize the agenda for each meeting. And then I've also found Notion to be quite helpful for organizing all of my links and resources. This is kind of like a bit of a work in progress because I don't know whether this format is useful, where I'm just kind of collating different links under different headings, things like manuals and processes for uni, things related to ethics. Otherwise, I've been sort of trialing using a kanban board for this, where I'll have things that are sort of organized under a bigger heading, like for skills, I have different skills that I want to learn, like R, and then when I click into the R card, I've got all of the different resources related to R. Still sort of like trying to come up with an ideal sort of glorified bookmark bar, but it's been quite handy for me to be able to go back to when I need help with something. And then I've also created this conference tracker. It's basically a table of different conferences that I want to keep an eye out for, the dates, locations, costs, and also keeping track of conferences that I'm applying for. A little bit empty at this moment because I'm only really just starting to look into different conferences, but I imagine it'll be quite useful for me later on to figure out which ones are worth going. Otherwise, I'm using Notion a lot for my YouTube, and I found that my workflow from video idea to published video works a lot better in Notion, and it's just kind of like a seamless process at this point. But sadly, that's not the case for my PhD, which, yeah, it's a little bit sad because I did want to have everything in my life on Notion all in one place, but it looks like there's just some functionality that's better on other apps. And that leads me to Obsidian. Obsidian is essentially a note-taking app, which I find to be a bit more functional for taking longer notes compared to Notion. I think for me, it's just easier to manipulate text. And I think for me, the biggest advantage to using Obsidian over Notion is the ability to be able to split screen. And that helps so much. So there's the option to split either right down and look here, or also split horizontally, or all at once. And this is really useful to be able to take notes at the same time, or sort of copy some ideas over from one note to another. And I found this the most helpful for when I'm planning to do like a literature review. I can open up my document on one side and then also open up some of my notes from a study and just sort of copy some ideas over into my planning document here and kind of go from there instead of constantly having to switch windows like on Notion. I think the ability to link pages and use tags is a lot more superior, although I haven't been using too much of that. And really when I'm citing particular studies, I will just kind of put that in and then I can easily click on that link and go and see the note for the study. And then it's also been quite helpful for me to tag different studies with different topics, and then you're able to have like a sort of a graphical view of your notes, which is kind of cool, although I haven't really been using it. But yeah, anyway, I've been using Obsidian only really for actual notes, and I separate this into 3 categories. First, I've got paper notes, which is just summaries of different papers that I've been reading. These follow a template separated out into different sections of a paper. Then next, I've got learning notes, and these are kind of summaries of key concepts, just generally kind of like a reference for me to go back to and make sure that I've got the right information rather than being a particular paper that I'm summarizing. And I've used this a lot to take notes from the resources that I've compiled in Notion. Whereas Notion would be a bit of a bookmark bar type thing. Obsidian is more about like summarizing those resources and learning from it. Another section is any notes related to projects. So this would be planning a literature review for one of my studies or summarizing what I'm doing when I'm analyzing data. So that's about it in terms of information management. I can definitely see myself switching completely to Obsidian at one point, but I just don't think I figured out all of the things that it can do. And for me, being able to have information in a table, just like Notion does, is definitely useful, which is why I haven't really moved completely over from Notion yet. It looks like Obsidian does get updated quite frequently and they're constantly adding new functionality to it. So I do think that in the future it would be as useful, if not more useful than Notion. Maybe a controversial take, but... And now onto the task management stuff. So with this, I tend to see it as a bit of a zoom in and out kind of process. So I need something that can help me plan in the next 3-4 years and see the big picture, but also be able to break these things down into more manageable tasks so that I know what I'm doing for the next month, next week, and next day. And so for this, I've been using a combination of Google Sheets, Trello, and my bullet journal. I think I took a lot of inspiration for my big picture planning from my old RA job, which used Excel and Trello quite heavily, which I think is why I've ended up sort of using a lot of the different apps. But so far it makes sense for me. So I've got this Google Sheet document with different sheets that aim to plan out my PhD to varying levels of detail. First, we've got this Gantt chart. I've mainly made this because this is something that gets shown at a progress review, but it's been actually helpful for me to visualize different stages of each study and plan out my PhD in a more of a big picture level. So just to give an overview, I've separated this out by year, and then I've got the months at the top, and they correspond to the year of my PhD. So I started in October. A year for me would be October to October. And yeah, I'm trying to have like a marker to see how far along I am. And I've separated this out into different studies, and then also separating out the thesis component, which is mainly the 2 big progress meetings and then also the thesis writing. And then for each study, I've sort of broken it down into very big, broad phases. For example, it'd be like planning or protocol writing, literature search, data analysis, and write-up for a meta-analysis, and something similar for each study. And basically when I expect to be working on each particular phase, that's marked by the colors that correspond to the months. So for example, we are in June. I'm meant to be finishing off the protocol and starting the literature search for my meta-analysis, and then also doing the data analysis for my other study. These two next sheets are only relevant for writing. This is a template that's actually got given to me by an older PhD student, and I'm hoping to use this a lot more when I get more into writing. So I will probably adapt these once I actually start writing more seriously. So far I've just been working on a small section of one of my first papers. So I'm not 100% sure about how this is going to go. But anyway, first we've got this version tracker. It's basically to keep track of how many revisions each section of each paper undergoes. And yeah, as you can see here, I've only just finished a draft of the methods for one of my studies. Yeah, I think it'd be quite interesting to see how many iterations each section goes through before it actually gets submitted. We'll see how that will work once I actually start doing this process. And then this first draft sheet is a more detailed tracker of the first draft of each paper. I think the biggest hurdle to writing up a paper is the first draft, which is why I think it would be useful to just track how much I've written. Again, this is quite empty at the moment, but basically each paper is broken down by a percentage of each section. So like the methods of a paper is roughly 20% of a paper. And then in the cells here, I'll write down the percentage of each section that I've done. And this next sheet is the one that I use the most out of this entire workbook. It's basically just a more in-depth breakdown of the Gantt chart. So it's separated out by studies, and each study is also separated into the big phases that are kind of similar, slightly different to the Gantt chart, but they make sense for me at least. And each phase is broken down into more detailed tasks. So for example, the data collection for my second study involves a pilot. It also involves data collection with student participants and the main data collection on Prolific. And similar, the data analysis portion of the study involves data cleaning, data analyzing, doing some exploratory analyses, and checking the data. And this next column, the milestone due date, is where I try to put dates to things. I think it's pretty helpful to set due dates to keep things moving along, and it's been quite helpful for me to make sure that I do things in a timely manner. And then this next column is date completed. I've recently added this column, so some of the dates actually probably not the best indicator of how on time I am with things, but I think it will be quite useful to make sure that I actually complete things within the time that I give myself. But it also helps me to see whether my due dates that I set for myself are reasonable. And then this priority column is just to help me prioritize tasks. Usually my tasks sort of start out as a low priority, particularly tasks that are not urgent this year, and then they sort of move up priority the closer to the due date they get. But some tasks do start out as a medium or a high priority, depending on how important they are. This next column is just to check the progress of the tasks. I like to make a distinction between an in-progress task and things that I'm waiting for. So this is things that are outside of my circumstances that I shouldn't worry about, but things that are in progress are things that I'm actively working on. So that's about it for the Google Doc. And I also started to use Trello quite recently, actually. This is another thing that I discovered at my job, and I loved the functionality a lot better than what Notion does with their kanban boards. I did try to kind of use the same sort of principles in Notion using their version of the kanban board, but I think the functionality does lack a little bit, and it's a bit better in Trello because that's what it's designed to do. And yeah, sadly there's not a really good integration method between the two apps, but so far I found it quite fine to sort of skip between different apps, particularly as I've sort of started to use Notion only for the knowledge management side of things. So how this works is that each column represents a category, whether it's a particular study or sort of admin stuff or opportunities, things that are not related to my PhD. And each card either represents a discrete to-do task or a list of tasks related to a task. So yeah, anyways, this is something that's I found quite useful to be able to just dump things that aren't necessarily tasks but also reminders. So I'm quite flexible with how each card operates. This is mainly where I keep all of my relevant but not directly related to my PhD tasks, things like conferences that I want to look into, thesis competitions that I want to keep an eye on, and some reminders about things to look into. And again, yeah, like similar admin things like reminding myself to back up my work and organize my reference manager, clean up my computer, things like that. And then for each study, I tried to be a little bit consistent with a milestone card, which basically kind of each checklist mimics the different milestones in the Excel sheet, but still is a little bit more detailed. And I also found it quite useful to break tasks down even further here. So like, for example, I've listed data checking as a card, and this is a checklist of specific analyses that I need to do when I'm checking the data to make sure that I've checked it quite thoroughly. And same here, writing up the results mimics one of the milestones that I have in the PhD planning spreadsheet. And I will break that down into further to make sure that I've finished the tables, check the data, do certain analyses, things like that. Apart from the studies and the other columns that I've just showed, I also have a bit of a reminders column, and this is just a random collection of things that sort of pop up on the go, or I might kind of write these down from my bullet journal just to make sure that I've sort of saved it in a more secure place. Yeah, as you can see, it's just all random things like looking into particular papers. I like to have a little wins card which just lists all of like tiny little milestones that I've achieved, and it's quite nice to look back on. And so this Trello board is something that I keep a bit more on the forefront than my Excel sheet. I try to review Trello weekly, but the Excel sheet, I might look at it maybe every 2 weeks or once a month, something like that. But yeah, I definitely look at the Trello board almost on a daily basis. And for an even more in-the-moment planning, I use my trusty bullet journal. It might seem a little bit redundant at this point since I'm using all of these apps, but since I've had and used the bullet journal for so long, every single day, it's quite hard for me to let go of it. And I think I do find it a lot easier to have on me at all times and plan things on the go and yeah, plan out what I'm going to do each day rather than doing it digitally through one of the many apps that I use. So I really simplified the way that I use my bullet journal. I basically write out the week and assign tasks from Trello for each day. And depending on what task it is, I might put it in my weekly to-do space and then break it down for each day. And I think for some tasks, I definitely work a lot better and it's a lot less daunting for me if they're broken down into very tiny pieces that I try to commit to do each day. Otherwise, when planning, I also just put tasks into the weekly list. And on this side is my goal tracking stuff. I've been following the 12-week here, and so this is where I track my weekly goals. I'm not really going to go into this video, but let me know if goal setting is something that you're interested in, and I might make a video on this later. So putting this into action, I tend to really only seriously review the Excel sheet about once a month, maybe every couple of weeks if I know that there are some big things that are sort of due. But every week I do make a point of reviewing my Trello board and then see what items that I can tick off for that week. And then when I'm planning each week, I generally have a pretty good idea of what kind of milestone task that I need to do without looking at the Excel sheet. But sometimes I might quickly glance at it. But then I tend to mainly go off Trello when planning out my week. And so to do that in my bullet journal, I generally first write out each day of the week and then add any important things like appointments, meetings, things like that are on that week. And then I start collating my weekly tasks. So I like to separate between my PhD work, paid work, committee stuff, YouTube, and personal life. It's quite a few categories to keep track of, but I think I like making sure that I at least tick off one task for each of the category each week. And it kind of helps me keep balanced on all of these things. And then once I'm done with that, I normally tend to have a look at my week and sort of delegate different tasks for each day. And then I might be a little bit more specific for my daily tasks and write out like tiny steps, tiny actions to do each day compared to my weekly lists, which are a little bit more vague. So that's pretty much it for my organization system. In summary, I delegate some apps to information management, which is Notion and Obsidian, and my Google Sheets, Trello, and bullet journal are pretty much only for task management, so managing kind of my everyday life. And so yeah, I suppose I like to kind of take this massive task of doing a PhD, and then break that down even further into different phases of each study, which kind of guides how my months and weeks and then days will be planned out. So it's a bit of a like from a broad to a specific and then back to broad kind of process. So yeah, I could talk about this for hours, but hopefully this provides a nice overview for the different things that I use. I hope that you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them because I'm constantly trying to improve things that I use and how I use them, and just make things a little bit more streamlined and easier for me to keep track of. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time.